Welcome back. Have you been here before? This show questions the idea of past lives, and so far we've seen actress Anne Charleston undergo a regression session where she appeared to recall the life of Kate Joyce, who grew up during hard times in Ireland during the 1840s.
I'm thin. I don't think Peter's got much longer. I think he's dying.
A gripping tale, but is it true? Could Anne really have been remembering moments from a past life? Time to hear from our panel of experts.
In terms of past life regression, I don't believe there's any such thing. What I think people experience when they go through past life regression is a set of emotions and memories and fragments of experiences that they've had that they put together and try and make sense of and call that a past life memory.
Of course, you can take people back into past lives using past life regression. You can take people into future lives using future life progression, if that's what you want to call it. You can tell people that they're living a life on Mars. I do this myself every night in my nightclub act. When I tell people that they're now living on Mars and they'll happily invent a life where they live on Mars and they have a beautiful wife with green skin and 3 eyes, and they'll sing songs for me in Martian, and it doesn't mean it's any real any more than it means that their past life regression is real.
Some people say we use only 10% of our brain. The brain happens to be the most powerful computer in the universe. But as time goes by, scientists and the hard medical establishment will be able to discover those dark corners of your brain where past memories are probably stored from past lives.
In a moment, I'll be meeting Anne to find out how she feels since her regression. But first, our expert historian unravels the clues. Could there be any proof to back up Anne's story?
Okay, so we're in rural Ireland in the 19th century, and a simple tale of peasant farmers struggling to survive in what, let's face it, are pretty harsh conditions. Now, Anne gives us several details about the names in her story. There is, of course, Kate, but there's also her husband, James Higgins, and their son, Peter. Now, I couldn't find any trace of those names, but there were other details in her regression that I thought were particularly revealing. And here's the first one.
Are you aware of having any clothes on?
A dress. It's rough, sort of calico.
And what kind of shoes are you wearing?
Heavy, black boots.
Anne's description of a peasant farm in rural Ireland is pretty good. Kate's clothes are pretty typical for farm living. Practical clothes for a hard and labour-intensive life.
Now, I've been studying 19th century history for a long time, and one of the things I really like about it is that it's full of fantastic contemporary accounts that tell us about life at the time. Take this one, from a French guy called Gustave de Beaumont, who passed through Ireland in 1839. Imagine 4 walls of dried mud, having for its roof little straw and some sods. For its chimney, a hole cut in the roof. A miserable fire, the ashes of which cover a few potatoes, the sole nourishment of the family. I have just described the home of the Irish farmer.
What kind of food do you eat?
We have bread and cheese, porridge. My mother cooks potatoes.
Anne's detail is spot on. Potatoes were a cheap and readily available meal, easily grown in the Irish climate. They became fundamental to the Irish peasant's diet. And Anne also gives us other clues about Kate's childhood.
And do you have to go to school?
No, we have to work in the fields.
So, no education and plenty of hard work, just the sort of thing you'd expect a rural peasant of that period to have to endure. And let's not forget, back then Ireland was ruled by a bunch of pretty heavy-handed English landlords who had far more interest in working the land and the people on it as hard as they possibly could, rather than worrying about their welfare or even their education. So I think Anne's description of the world around her is pretty good. But what happens next? What happened when she grew up?
A man in the house.
Is this man a friend of the family?
Well, my fathers want me to marry him.
And how do you feel about marrying him?
I don't want to.
Now, to me, this sounds like an arranged marriage, and certainly not impossible for the time. Anne tells us that Kate's husband has a large farm, and that kind of strategic match could lift a poor household out of the poverty trap. It was a good deal for everyone. But Anne also gives us one more detail about James.
And where does he meet the men friends?
The Shebeen.
A shebeen is an Irish pub, often selling illicit liquor. It's exactly the place where a husband might hide out. Your average farmer would have spent quite a lot of his time in a place like this. So Anne paints a fairly realistic picture of life in 19th century Ireland, and there are one or two other details that I think are particularly startling, and they start with the crops.
What's happened to the crops or the harvest?
No good. Not enough food. People are dying.
Are many people dying?
Yeah.
What Anne's describing is a famine, thousands of people dying due to failing crops, and for me this is where our investigation really takes a turn. I think she's talking about the Irish potato famine, the worst disaster to hit Ireland in its long and troubled history. Over 1 million died, nearly 2 million more emigrated to escape the worst of it. And there's one more clue that really clinches it.
Last 2 years, 1843 to 44.
Anne gives us the 2 years that the crops failed.
So that gives us the year 1845, the exact date the famine started. Now all that detail Anne gave us about life at the time, I thought was pretty convincing. But do you?
It's an extraordinary story.
Yeah.
How vivid were the pictures for you?
At the beginning, it was very, very hazy, and it took a while before I suddenly started to see things clearly. But it wasn't as though I was actually there. It was more I was remembering. And what was interesting, and I don't think the microphone picked it up, but I was aware at the time, towards the end, that my stomach was groaning. It was making extraordinary noises, and it wasn't because I was hungry, because I'd had a sandwich before I went in there.
So you got quite close then in that case to the experience, the sort of the
Yes,
the
I did at that
there.
point. Yeah.
Which is a strange feeling.
Oh yes, it was quite odd.
And it's you said it's a tragic story, the story of the girl being forced to marry the man she didn't love and to leave the farm boy behind. And I think most people watching it would when we found out that you were married, who she married to, oh, it's not Peter.
It's not Peter.
Oh, no. And everybody when we saw it went, oh no, it's such a sad tale.
And I think it's something that probably happened a lot, not just in Ireland, but I think at that time. It happened to a lot of girls because marriage was a transaction rather than a love match.
You have to declare an interest here because, of course, you live now in Ireland.
Yes.
So what's your background there?
Well, my family were Irish. My grandparents were Irish. But I was born and brought up in Melbourne, and so were my parents.
So do you, in that case, know much about Irish history?
I've read a bit about Irish history, yes. I mean, I do know about the potato famine, but then everybody who lives in Ireland does.
And did you know the precise dates of that, of the
Your detective said that it started in 1845. Actually, I thought it started earlier.
So do you think that you were telling a tale, being an actress?
Who'd make that up? You know, it was pretty desperate. I mean, if I was going to make something up for myself, surely I would make up something beautiful and salubrious and comfortable.
After the regression, you said that you hoped that it would give you a better understanding of yourself. Did you come anywhere near to that?
I don't know that it gave me a greater understanding of myself, but I do remember that a few days later I was sitting with a friend and we were discussing all sorts of deep things like life and death and so forth, and completely out of the blue I said something that I had never said before the regression, which was, hey, death's only a hiccup. And that was a complete change. I mean, I think most of us fear death a bit. But after that, my feeling was, it's a blip.
Did it surprise you that had come out of your mouth?
It did, yes. I'd said it before I was really aware of what I was saying.
You also said that, that this is not something that's left best alone. I mean, some people would think if you were supposed to remember this stuff, then you'd remember it. But you don't feel that.
No, I don't. And there are a lot of people who do remember. I mean, there are countless cases of little children saying, you know, I don't live here, I live over there, and wanting to go back to where they'd been before. So obviously some people do remember. With others, you have to maybe dig a little deeper to find out.
Would you go back again?
Oh, I'd give it another try. Why not?
Marry Peter this time.
Yes, change the story completely.
Change the story and have something else.
Yes, have something
that was
nice.
salubrious, like you said, that
Yes.
you wanted to have. Thank you for the moment. You've heard what Anne thinks. What do you make of her story? A flight of fancy or a plausible past? Here's what the experts think.
Anne Charleston's regression to a poverty-stricken life in Ireland, not really so surprising given her background, given the fact she now lives in Ireland, given the fact that Irish history must be a very important topic for her. And all the details she came up with in her regression really are pretty well known and wouldn't surprise anybody who knew about Irish history, including, of course, the terrible potato famine in which many thousands died and many more thousands emigrated.
Anne's past life experience story is interesting. I showed it to somebody who was a fan of Neighbours, and they managed to point out all kinds of parallels between this new story and the roles that Anne had played in Neighbours.
In Anne's past life, I don't think if it was a figment of fantasy of her mind, she would go back to a past life that, one, was quite mundane, and two, was in a country she now lives in. I think she would have created some bigger fantasy than that. This was too real a life for it to be imaginary.
So there you go, you've heard the evidence for and against. It's time to ask Anne that important question now, put her right on the spot and say, do you think you've been here before?
Yes, I do. But I kind of believe that anyway.
This has just reinforced it. Anne, thank you very much. Nice to talk to you. Join us again next time for another chance to explore the possibility that we might have been here before.